Thank you so much for being here with us to talk about the 2019 New Mexico legislative session, which is really an enormous victory for the cause of civil liberties. I'm Katie Hepner, and I'm joined by my colleagues Stephen Allen, who is the Director of Public Policy, Barron Jones, who is our Smart Justice Coordinator, Ellie Rushforth, who is a reproductive justice attorney here, and Stephanie Corte, who is Immigrant Rights Campaign Strategist. So we're going to jump right in, and we'll start by talking about some of the biggest successes and also some of our disappointments. So let's start with you, Steve. What was the most exciting victory and also the biggest disappointment?
Well, it was an incredibly exciting session. The ACLU of New Mexico was founded in 1962, and I don't think we've ever had a legislative session where we passed so many pieces of historical legislation. I mean, the biggest sort of family of bills was in the criminal justice realm, but we also passed a major bill around expanding driver's license access to undocumented immigrants, and this great reproductive rights bill, which Ellie will talk about. But I think it's just the way that we put resources into this entire process is so important, because part of it is passing these bills, and it was exciting to see a governor sign just so many fantastic pieces of legislation. But what was even more exciting for me was to have this larger cultural debate around civil liberties and how important it is, and to see the governor move, to see Republicans move on this, to see some of our more conservative Democrats, to see the media move, and to see the general public. The way this entire conversation happened over these couple months, that was the exciting thing for me, and it builds a platform for the future. We accomplished incredibly exciting things this legislative session, but we're really set up in future sessions to do even more great work.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And what about for you, Barron?
Okay, my biggest victory, the biggest victory this year, in my eyes, is the way we were able to get have folks come from the community and give us a hand in promoting this legislation. Yeah. It was major to see folks really engaged in the process and sort of really eager to sort of speak truth to power. Many folks, weren't aware that they could be involved in the process. As far as legislation goes, I'm really excited that we passed a couple pieces of second chance. We had signed into law a couple pieces of second chance legislation, and HB 370, which is an expungement law. It would allow individuals to clear their criminal past so they can move on to safe housing and gainful employment. And SB 96, which is ban the box. I know I'm a convicted person, and I know at times, throughout my history, when there was a box that I had to check on the application, it would cause me to sort of, make up some excuse to extricate myself from the situation and go tear the application up or come up with a good lie that I know wouldn't make it. So I'm really excited that we have legislation in the state that will allow folks who made past mistakes move on with their lives. So yeah, that's a big. But all the criminals, everything we've done, I'm just sort of super excited about it, just because the engagement was just major. So
yeah, it was a great session for criminal justice reform. Absolutely. What about for you, Ellie?
Sure. So I think you're going to hear from all of us how exciting and amazing it was to have citizen activists up at the legislature nearly every day. Advocating for these issues that matter to them, sharing their stories with legislators, is really why we do this work. I think, getting to work with allies, activists, advocates, and an incredible coalition around reproductive health rights and justice is a true honor and privilege for me. For a more concrete example, the governor signed into law last week HB 89, expanded insurance coverage for contraception, which is a huge victory for reproductive health care in New Mexico. It allows for expanded dispensing of contraception, coverage for over-the-counter methods. It closes, or it allows for both male and female contraception, and it protects the no-cost sharing that people really rely on. It's a huge victory, especially for rural New Mexicans who don't necessarily have access to regular healthcare.
Absolutely. I think it's going to make a huge difference for a lot of New Mexicans.
Absolutely.
And Stephanie, what do you think?
Yeah, so for me, it was seeing how New Mexicans from all across the state came together to support immigrants at our Immigrant Day of Action in January. It was really an incredible sight. It was one of the largest lobby days that had ever been planned at the Roundhouse. We had close to 800 people at the actual rally itself, and it was incredible to see leading up to that day how we had so many activists get ready and plan trainings in their communities. So we had several trainings all across the southern part of New Mexico, the central part, and the northern part. And we saw so many community activists and immigrant families themselves getting ready to lobby the legislators. And then it all came together at our lobby day, and it was really incredible to see how the community, regardless of whether they were personally impacted or not, there were going to be community activists every single day at the Roundhouse talking to their representatives and telling them that they had to support our immigrants here in the state of New Mexico.
That we're a little bit disappointed about. So let's stick with you, Stephanie, for a moment. What during the legislative session disappointed you?
Yeah, so, we had a very ambitious agenda, and so we knew right off the bat that it was going to take a lot to really move the House and the Senate to pass all of our immigration bills. For me, personally, it was disappointing not seeing SB 196 pass through. That was our major bill that would ensure that no state and local resources were going to be spent on enforcing federal immigration law. And that is huge. It would have made New Mexico one of the leading states in ensuring that immigrant communities were going to be protected, that we were building trust within immigrant communities and local law enforcement. And all sorts of studies have shown that when you build trust with immigrant communities and local police, when you stop the local resources from being used to help ICE and other arms of the federal immigration, that communities are actually safer, that people come forward and talk about crimes they've seen, and they're not scared to call police. And so not having that bill was passed was pretty disappointing, but we did plant a lot of seeds of support with different legislators to make sure that we follow through with that bill to the next session.
Great. And Ellie, what was disappointing for you?
So we
Let me
had
guess.
we had a pretty big disappointment this session when the Senate failed to pass HB 51, the bill to decriminalize abortion. So what the legislation would have done is repeal an old, outdated, dangerous law from our books. It's over 50 years old that makes abortion a felony in most cases. This is not a radical bill, it's a common sense bill. And, unfortunately, there was I'll say it again, there was a dangerous and intentional misinformation campaign around what this bill does. But, I'll say, while this was a huge disappointment, creating a space, like Stu said, for people to come together and share their stories. People were sharing their deeply personal stories in committee and on the House and Senate floor about how this bill and access to safe and legal abortion impacts them and their families. And so I do count that as a victory. It's a tough bill to talk about, as you can tell. We really, we know that the majority of New Mexicans believe that women, in consultation with their families, their faith, and their healthcare provider, can make these kinds of deeply personal decisions, and it is the last place for government interference. so we're going to keep on fighting with this one, but we know that New Mexicans support it, and we just need to keep having these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Baron?
Yes, there are three bills that never became law that sort of leave me extremely disappointed. There is one bill, and I believe it doesn't matter where it got stranded at. It would have decriminalized simple possession, and I really wanted that bill to go because, as we all know, here in New Mexico, communities are just devastated by that particular law, the felonization of simple possession, when folks are just having small amounts of controlled substances so they can take care of their habits, and so that was very disappointing. And then the governor failed to sign in my opinion, a common sense law that would have HB 564 would have set some guidelines for probation and parole. And as we know, I think the Legislative Finance Committee just came out with a report last fall that shows the state spends about $40 million a year incarcerating individuals for technical violations, which means they don't commit a new crime. They just maybe have a dirty UA or late to an appointment, and they find themselves back in prison. And that's costly. And not only that, it's costly to with public money, but the devastation to communities and families is just it's ridiculous. And then the last one that I want to say that disappointed me, and I'm drawing a blank right now. Was no. How they gutted HB 364.
Oh, yeah.
We that bill has some serious protections in there that would ensure that folks who are incarcerated exit incarceration. They survive it with their mental facilities intact. Maybe I'm using the wrong word. And that bill was sort of gutted for very, very bad reasons. I mean, it was sort of disappointing, as Ellie pointed out, the disinformation that went involved during the committee process and how that bill was gutted. And so that's sort of hurt my feelings because I'm in contact with people who are in solitary confinement, and reading their words, just tears me up, and we could have did something about that, but we're not done yet. So yeah.
Ellie and Stephanie both said they still have hope despite some of their disappointments.
Yeah.
Do you still have hope?
I'm 100% hopeful. I'm usually a cynical person, but in this matter, I just think that it's gonna come down to just talking to folks and just sort of having that culture shift that Steve talked about earlier, and really illustrating why this is bad practice and we need to stop it here in New Mexico.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. I share all of that disappointment that for each of those the reasons that Stephanie, Ellie, and Barron mentioned. I think one of the most disappointing things about this process is that our opposition often uses disinformation, and we saw that over and over again. We saw it with the sanctuary bill. We definitely saw it with the decriminalization of the abortion bill. We saw it with the probation and parole bill really strongly. I think it's a really disappointing part of politics, in the modern world, right? And that leads to a lot of cowardice, quite frankly, from some of our politicians that should be better than that. We can have these sort of one-on-one conversations with a senator or a representative or even someone in the governor's office, and they know what the right thing is to do, but they don't do it because they don't have the courage to go out on a limb, and that's partly on us, honestly. I mean, we have to create the environment where they can have that courage because politicians aren't going to do it without that, unfortunately, often. And so that's that's really disappointing. And I think I want to give a shout out though to our organizers. Barron did this exceptional job of bringing people who are survivors of crime and people who are formerly incarcerated to become part of this process. We saw Miriam Maestas, who's our reproductive rights organizer, brought in folks from all over the state to talk about the importance of getting access to reproductive health care. We saw, Stephanie worked with Maria Coronado and Jorge Rodriguez in our Las Cruces office to have that incredibly successful Immigrant Day of Action. That is a new thing for the ACLU. I mean, over the last couple of years, we've done more sort of citizen engagement and figuring out our activists, how to sort of create additional opportunities for people to engage, and I think that was one of the most exciting things to see. It's hard to see the disappointment when things go wrong, because it's we're used to getting beaten up, but when people go up there and have those disappointments, it makes it hard, but we've built a foundation for the future.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's an important thing to focus on in the aftermath. Bills that were passed seems like they part pretty significantly from the past and how past administrations have viewed public safety. So with the passage of these laws, how do you think that changes the landscape in New Mexico?
Oh man, it is big time. You're talking about, we passed legislation that prioritizes behavioral health interventions for individuals who are incarcerated, and which a lot of times, those needs weren't met inside of correctional facilities. So when people exited, they really didn't have much, I guess, tools to sort of tackle the issues that plagued them. So overall, I believe that this legislation now is going to set the stage for folks getting help. We're going to start seeing a reduction in the number of people in our prisons and jails and in our communities. Eventually, start restoring health to our communities that are devastated by incarceration. Here in New Mexico, I think our blueprint report, which was recently released, I think in the summer, showed that I think the prison population, although Hispanic men are something like 40% of the general population, 61% in prison, and African Americans like something like 1.2 in the general population, but they comprise of 8% of the prison population. So these laws that are going into effect will eventually give folks the path away from incarceration into productivity.
Yeah, that's a really exciting new direction for our state to be taking.
Big time, especially considering the last 8 years. Much of some of this legislation had actually made it to the previous governors. That's like expungement.
Yeah.
I think it was vetoed by 2. I think it came up 3 times. Or it was introduced 3 times, but vetoed twice by both the Republican and Democratic governors. So it just shows that now our system as a whole, our criminal legal system as a whole, will be a little bit more in tune to what the folks need. The needs of the people of New Mexico.
Absolutely. Stephanie, it seems like every day there's a new attack coming out of the Trump administration on immigrant families. How did the New Mexico legislature this session, what measures did they take to protect immigrant families here in New Mexico?
So the one bill that was passed in our suite of sanctuary bills was SB 278. That's the driver's license bill. And that's actually a victory that's been waited for several years now. Our previous driver's license laws in the past were completely butchered by the previous governor. And so these changes now make it easier for all New Mexicans, but specifically for our immigrant community, to be able to gain access to a standard driver's license. And the main thing that it gets rid of is the fingerprinting requirement. That was something that kept a lot of immigrant families from getting licenses, as well as other folks like homeless people and veterans and all kinds of different people who live here in New Mexico. And it also got rid of the negative stigma around the old license. And so now this new standard license is just going to be called the New Mexico license, and it has to be accepted in all local and state agencies and businesses at the same way that the real ID is accepted. And so that's a really great way of making sure that our immigrant communities are able to access something that they need for their everyday lives, to be able to get to work. But we definitely still have a lot of work to do. Like you said, the administration is constantly attacking our immigrant communities. And so we are already working on what we're going to do in the next session and how we're going to work with the governor to ensure that immigrant communities aren't fearful of deportation, that they can just live their lives and take their kids to school and go to the court for whatever they might need without the fear that they're being tracked or by ICE or going to be deported at any moment's notice. And so, I mean, thankfully we do have a governor that is very supportive of immigrant communities. She has stood against a lot of things that Trump has done in
That's
the border communities. And so we're hoping that we can grow that into actual legislation or action that will dramatically change the day-to-day lives of immigrant communities in New Mexico.
Great. Ellie, we talked a little bit about HB 51 and the disappointment around that bill. Why was that bill so important for reproductive rights, and how do we push forward?
Sure. So, you know, in the last 10 or so years, over 400 pieces of legislation have been passed around the country that seek to limit access to abortion care. With the Trump administration, their executive actions against abortion access and, in all departments and agencies, it's crossing boundaries. It's entering the immigration sphere, it's entering the criminal justice sphere, and, reproductive justice is criminal justice, is immigrant justice. And, so with the new makeup of the Supreme Court, we know that there are, give or take, 20 or so cases in the pipeline that could impact access to abortion care, that could implicate Roe. Right. And we know that the conservative justices are ready to take away your rights to safe and legal abortion care in this country. What HB 51 sought to do was preserve access to safe and legal abortion in New Mexico, regardless of what happens at the federal level. And what happens next? We keep having these conversations with our friends, our families, our neighbors to make sure that they know that access to safe and legal abortion is a priority for New Mexico. And, along those same lines, like Steve said, we want to create a supportive environment for legislators that are doing the right thing and hold those that are not accountable.
Was there a particular piece of misinformation that you saw? You talked a little bit about misinformation.
There's a list. I saw
One
some horrible
piece.
stuff.
I think that, I don't want to get into the specifics of what, quite frankly, it's not just misinformation, it's just lies.
Okay.
It's, the demonization of women who are seeking healthcare and healthcare providers that are providing that needed, wanted, and legal healthcare was particularly troublesome this session. We say it all the time, that abortion is healthcare and healthcare is not a crime, and we want people to know that that is the case, and to create a safe place for people to share their experiences, because we know that criminalizing abortion doesn't stop abortion, it just makes it dangerous for people that are in need of it.
Thank you.
Can I say, we have a lot of great work ahead. We're looking forward to doing with our base of supporters around the state. That means moving forward again with legislation that didn't get through this time, figuring out a path for that. But I also need to point out that all of these pieces of legislation that pass, they're meaningless unless they're actually enforced, and unless we sort of have a plan for making sure that they're followed in some way. I think the solitary confinement bill is a great example. Barry mentioned a couple times that it was gutted. What he means by that is that they removed this thing called the Mandela Rule, which would keep people would prevent long-term solitary confinement, which is defined as 15 or more consecutive days. That was removed from the bill, and that is incredibly painful. What remains in the bill is a ban on using solitary confinement for children, using it on people with that are pregnant, and severely restricting its use for anyone with a mental illness. And most importantly of all, it requires all of these reporting mechanisms for any detention facility in the state. You take that package all together, and even though it was, maimed during the process because of the way our corrections department used misinformation, it is still the strongest solitary confinement bill that has ever been passed anywhere in the country. And but other states have gone further, and what we need to do now is use this as leverage to get to where Colorado is, because they've been able to apply the Mandela rule through policy, and they passed a much weaker law several years ago, and we're able to use that as leverage. That's an example. Like, each of these bills, we need to sort of work on how they're implemented, and that's an important part of our work.
Yeah, that's an absolutely great point. Steve, so we talked about some of the successes this legislative session. Do you see this legislative session as a particularly important year for the cause of civil liberties?
I do. I mean, it was a historic one. I think a lot of us were working really around the clock for months before the session even started, because this was a historic opportunity. We had one of the worst governors in place maybe that we've ever had in the history of our state, just for her incompetence, for her just hostility really to our entire worldview that civil liberties even matters. And so having a new governor come into place, having new legislators come into the House, this much more progressive, friendly House of Representatives, made it this historic opportunity. I think that's why we've seen in our decades-long history in this organization, we've never passed this many pieces of important legislation. And so that's fantastic. But it's just one session, right? I mean, and this is a long fight, right? In a way, we're in a fight for our lives in this country, given what we're seeing with our current presidential administration, the horrible way the U.S. Supreme Court has evolved over time. This is, at the end of the day, it's a big step forward, but it's just one step on a journey towards really making this country, transforming this country and our state into the place we need it to be for our kids and our families and our communities.
So I think we have a question from someone in the audience who is wondering, and we've touched on this a little bit, but just about how we push forward on some of the losses during this legislative session. So does anyone want to speak to that who maybe hasn't said much about it?
I said a lot about it, but I'll say just a little bit more. We have to come up with individualized plans for each piece of legislation that failed, and I think we're in the process of doing that. And that involves talking with our, the folks, not just our staff, because, at the end of the day, I think that's been a theme of this conversation, right? We're not going to win this just with ACLU staff. These victories wouldn't have happened just with the people in this room. It's a much bigger network that has to involve hundreds and even thousands of people. And so we need to come up with those individualized plans, really do deep debriefs, not just with our sort of the folks on staff here, but with the activists that were most involved, with your Justice Advisory Board, right? I mean, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, Baron, the way those folks sort of helped craft our entire platform, right, and what they'll do in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Since the Friday, I've had maybe about, and I'm not exaggerating, maybe about 20 calls from people wondering how we can, get going with this. We need to look at policies. So what we've been doing last year, many of these criminal justice bills, although some of them had been introduced, some of them like things that were stuck into the HB 342, the omnibus bill, that came from the mouths of the folks that we've connected with. I think since January 2018, we met with maybe about 30 agencies, organizations, and connected with about 600 folks or so who sort of told us what they thought needed to happen. And one of the things that HB 342 does is that it expands overdose overdose immunity for folks who are on probation, parole. There was a woman who had complained or told the story of her brother dying because the person that they're hanging out with did not want to call the police or seek help when they're experiencing an overdose. So what we're going to do, we have a Justice Advisory Board here at the ACLU of New Mexico, and it's comprised of formerly incarcerated people who have survived crime, and the goal is to sort of get the group involved with challenging and challenging what has been coming signed into law and ways we can make that better. And like I said, since I think Friday at noon, I've received maybe about 20 calls. Folks wanting they want to, we need to look at the policy. We gotta change this. Like, slow down. Let's take a deep breath. But I'm picking up what they're putting down, and so I'm ready to go. So that's one of the things I'll be doing in the next couple of days is to try to formulate a plan where I can mobilize folks and keep everyone empowered and keep the momentum going, because as Steve said, as everyone said here, that's sitting on these couches here, we can't do it without folks in the community. That's a major part of advocacy work. So I'm going to be calling folks. I'm going to be blowing up their phones. We have to get involved. And so, and if you know me, please be patient with me because I may bug you a little bit. But thank you for your help and support.
That's great that people are still feeling really energized.
It's contagious, and I'm still meeting with folks, and believe me, everyone who I think all together, as far as the criminal justice realm, I think I had a count, but I think we had maybe about 35 individuals come up to give testimony, and all those 35 individuals realized that this is just the very tip, and we need to push the needle further and really get the policymakers on our team.
For the Immigrant Rights Campaign, we're seeing that a lot of change can happen by passing protections on the county level and the city level. So there's a lot of great laws that are similar to SB 196, making sure that there's no resources being spent or that there is protections for immigrants in different communities. And so the latest one that just passed was here in Bernalillo County, so that was really great. But like Steve said,
it was during the session, right?
Yeah.
We sort of had to take a little break and get that thing passed.
And it was led by one of our coalition partners, El Centro, here in Albuquerque. So making sure that we debrief with our coalition partners, seeing what steps are next, and particularly for the immigrant community, a lot of things happen behind the scenes, or a lot of stuff we sometimes don't know. A lot of negative things happen to immigrant communities that we don't always know about because they're afraid of coming forward. And so we're working a lot with our Las Cruces office to make sure that folks are telling us when things are happening to them, when ICE shows up in their communities, when they're discriminated against in some way, we need to know about it so we can tell their stories and figure out ways to build in protections for that specific situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie.
I think there are a couple. So I think what was the original question? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, how do we push forward?
How do we push forward? So I mean, I'm going to echo what everybody has said. Stay engaged. There are opportunities to work with us, to work with our coalition partners, on the issues that you care about. Second thing is stay vigilant. Like Stephanie was saying, a lot of things are happening in our communities that we don't know about or that we hear about too late, because we're working to protect civil liberties of oftentimes the most vulnerable people in our communities. And the last thing is stay empathetic. Everybody's story is different, and we can't presume to know the needs of every single person in every single community. And when we're working with issues that we're incredibly passionate about and that impact our friends and family and ourselves, I think it's important to remember that we need to give one another the benefit of the doubt, and that we're working really hard to make our justice system work and our healthcare system to work for us.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for joining me to talk about the legislative session, and thank you all who tuned in to watch. If you have any questions for us, feel free to put them in the comments section, and we'll do our best to answer them as we can. But
Yeah.
thank you so much. And thanks for all your